Daniel Wigg and his partner bought their home last year, days before the first interest rate rise. They're now paying an extra $1,700 a month on their mortgage.
It's a huge difference, and that's a big hole of, money that we don't really have.
The 50-year-old is now working 3 nights a week at a bar on top of his full-time job to make ends meet.
Very fatigued. And I'm not getting any younger, so that's not getting any easier.
Daniel is one of the 37% of Australians with a mortgage. As interest rates on mortgages and business loans rise, in theory, consumer spending goes down, which makes it harder for businesses to put prices up, which brings down inflation.
If we're supposed to carry the burden of this inflation, it should just be more equally distributed. Don't understand how it is so lopsided.
Daniel's not the only one who has questions about how the Australian economy is managed. Many people want to know why some Australians are doing the heavy lifting and whether there are alternatives to increasing interest rates.
Well, there are alternatives to using interest rates for dealing with higher inflation. In the 1950s in particular, and in the 1960s, it was more common for governments to use fiscal policy, that is in particular to raise income tax. No government would do that these days. Under current arrangements, it's much more easy for politicians to say to people who are complaining about higher interest rates, oh, that's the decision of the Independent Reserve Bank, it's got nothing to do with us.
Why don't we raise superannuation contributions instead?
Well, at first blush, that's an interesting suggestion, and putting up the superannuation contribution rate would impact a much broader spread of the population. But there are some practical problems. It would require legislation, which wouldn't necessarily get through the Parliament, and that means that it would be a much slower response to rising inflation than changing interest rates, which can be done more or less overnight.
Would lifting the GST reduce inflation and be fairer?
Well, at first glance, lifting the GST would add to inflation by putting up the price of everything that's subject to the GST, although you assume that the Reserve Bank would look through that initial impact. But a GST increase would not necessarily be fairer than raising interest rates because it would impact most on those on low incomes.
Are interest rate rises counterproductive in taming inflation? Do they push up rents?
It's not the case that higher interest rates are a cause of, for example, rising rents. Landlords charge what the market will bear, and if the vacancy rate is low, as it is at the moment, then they will put rents up.
Is there a likelihood of changing the way inflation is managed so it's less of a burden on mortgage holders?
Well, the evidence tells us that putting interest rates up in order to quell inflation works.
And that means for now, mortgage holders like Daniel will have to continue to put in the extra hours to keep the economy in check. Fiona Blackwood, ABC News.